In this video, we're going to show the process of making the rails and stiles for 5-part doors using the appropriate coping and sticking cutters on a shaper. In these pictures, you can see the 5 parts clearly. The center panel, which is raised, the horizontal rails, which meet the vertical stiles. The ends of the rails have what's called a cope cut, which is an intricate cut on the end grain of the rail to match neatly around the stile's sticking cut. These sticking cuts provide a groove for the raised panel to float in. In the case of these doors, the raised panels are solid wood and therefore must float in the groove as they expand and contract with seasonal weather changes. Whether you're using a router table or a shaper to cut these door parts, making these cope and stick cuts typically requires special tooling. Here you can see the profile of the cutters required for both the cope cuts and the sticking cuts. The shaper cutters that we use provide us with a variety of profiles for these sticking cuts. Here you can clearly see those patterns as well as the groove that's made to allow the panel to float. The first step to make 5-part doors on the shaper is to cut the cope cuts at the end of the rails. Cutting the end grain first allows you to then go and clean up any tear out that you might have on the edge when you cut the long sticking cuts along the edge of the grain. The process starts with lumber that's ready to go, sized for the rails with the exact length. The width of the rails needs to be consistent such that the two edges are parallel. Here we have loaded the cope cutter into the shaper, and now it's time to put the sled on the shaper to hold the stock in position to make the cut along the end grain of the rails. With the sled mounted on the shaper, we start by clamping the stock in place and running each end over the cope cutter, creating the pattern. We're removing approximately 1 millimeter of material on each pass. So when we size the material for cutting, we size it 2 millimeters longer than the final dimension needs to be. Cope and stick sets vary, but with our coping kit, it copes with the face of the part face down on the sled. Next, we set up the shaper for the sticking cuts, which are on all parts, rails and stiles. We attach an outboard fence, so the stock will ride against the outboard fence, and the cutter will remove the opposing edge and create a sticking profile. For quality and safety, a power feeder is used to move the stock through the cut. We tip the power feeder toward the outboard fence so that it's driving the part into the outboard fence, maintaining constant contact. With our shaper set, the sticking cuts are performed face up. With the shaper set up, it's a function of feeding the parts in one by one as they're passed over the sticking cutter, creating the profile we want. At this point, the stiles are all oversized and long, and we will trim them to length as needed. The rails, however, are cut to length already and have been coped. The sticking cut will remove any tear out that took place while we did the cope cuts on the end of the rails. Finally, our cope and stick cuts are done, and we have a nice pile of parts ready for the next step. The next step is to cut the stiles to length. I'll be using a precision miter saw with a digital fence. I set the digital fence and the stop to the exact position that I need to ensure that the stiles are the right length. Then we grab the stiles, square up one end, slide it against the stop, and cut the other. We cut the stiles a little bit oversized so that when we glue the door together, we have room to trim the door to the final size, which also allows us to square the door perfectly even if the glue up isn't perfectly square on its own. Squaring up the door and removing the end and top of the door also gives us a nice clean line and removes any glue squeeze out that might have taken place between the rail and the stile at the glue joint. Finally, our door parts are ready to go. The next step is to make the raised panels, which I'll make in a subsequent video. Thanks for watching.